We turn this morning in God's Word to the book of Deuteronomy, the fifth book of the Bible. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the 5 books of Moses. And we're going to look at a passage that is from ancient Israel's legal landscape, a passage that talks about how they affirmed the culture of life, they sought to build a culture of life as we look at these themes from Our World Belongs to God, our contemporary testimony. This is a passage that speaks of what are called cities of refuge. Deuteronomy 19, the first 13 verses. When the Lord your God has destroyed the nations whose land he is giving you, and when you have driven them out and settled them in their towns and houses, then set aside for yourself 3 cities in the land the Lord your God is giving you to possess. Determine the distances involved and divide into 3 parts the land the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, so that a person who kills someone may flee for refuge to one of these cities. This is the rule concerning anyone who kills a person and flees there for safety. Anyone who kills a neighbor unintentionally, without malice aforethought. For instance, a man may go out into the forest with his neighbor to cut wood, and as he swings his axe to fell a tree, the head may fly off and hit his neighbor and kill him. That man may flee to one of these cities and save his life. Otherwise, the avenger of blood might pursue him in a rage, overtake him if the distance is too great, and kill him even though he is not deserving of death, since he did not do it to his neighbor with malice since he did it to his neighbor without malice aforethought. This is why I command you to set aside for yourself 3 cities. And if the Lord your God enlarges your territory, as he promised on oath to your ancestors, and gives you the whole land he promised to them, because you carefully follow all these laws I command you today, to love the Lord your God and to walk always in obedience to him, then you are to set aside 3 more cities. Do this so that innocent blood will not be shed in your land, which the Lord your God is giving you as your inheritance, and so that you will not be guilty of bloodshed. But if out of hate someone lies in wait, assaults and kills a neighbor, and then flees to one of the cities, the killer shall be sent for by the town elders, be brought back from the city, and be handed over to the avenger of blood to die. Show no pity. You must purge from Israel the guilt of shedding innocent blood, so that it may go well with you. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Well, friends of Jesus, a few minutes ago we read from Our World Belongs to God. Life is a gift from God's hand. Receiving this gift thankfully, with reverence for the Creator, we protest and resist all that harms, abuses, or diminishes this gift of life. As we said at the time, after explaining our mission to point to Jesus, the CRC's contemporary testimony begins to describe how that vision becomes a reality in the practical ways that we live. And really, there's no better place to start than with the fundamental claim that life is valuable. All life is valuable because it was created by God and because God cares about his creatures, about his creation. The way that we understand this claim affects our response to this sacred trust that God has given us in the gift of life. Our text this morning directs attention to a very specific kind of situation in which Israel's legal system would work through what it meant to affirm a culture of life. Now, I don't think it takes a great deal of learning to understand the basic situation behind the text this morning, right? We can all understand the possibility of accidental homicide, whether we're old or young. Moses explains, a man may go into the forest with his neighbor to cut wood, and as he swings his axe to fell a tree, the head might fly off and hit his neighbor and kill him. Now, objectively speaking, we might recognize that such an event is a tragic accident. But I think we can also understand how not everyone might have the clarity of mind in that moment to do so. Human emotion being what it is, a near relative, particularly in the ancient Near East, where family and clan identity were vitally important, might deem it a matter of family honor to somehow go out and avenge this death. And so what God does is he provides a place for accused murderers to flee. He gives a process for justice to be served in his name and calls his people to embrace life and reverence for him as creator and as redeemer. So how does this culture of life thing work out in Israel? Well, one of the things that we see in these verses is that life is so important in God's sight that any killing, even accidental killing, has to be dealt with. There's a basic principle here that life is valuable. Life is worth paying attention to. There's a sense in the Old Testament that the only just sentence for the taking of life is to give a life here in return. The word used in chapter 19 for killing someone is the same word actually that's used in the Ten Commandments. Do not kill. The death penalty is the sentence for premeditated murder, both here in verses 11 to 13 and elsewhere in the Old Testament in Genesis 9. Because life is made in God's image, all life has dignity and value, and it cannot simply be taken without a big penalty being given. Because life is created in God's image, human life is made in God's image, we know that each person has dignity and value and worth. And so even accidental or careless killing has consequences in Israel. This is the rule concerning the man who kills his neighbor without malice aforethought, not intending to harm him, Moses explains. That man may flee to one of these cities and save his life. Now, this legislation about the cities of refuge is so important that it actually occurs several times over in the Old Testament. It occurs here. It occurs in Numbers chapter 35 with actually even a little more explanation there. It occurs in Deuteronomy 4, they talk about actually setting aside some of these cities. And then in Joshua 20, some of those cities are named again when the conquest is complete. God obviously wants his people to understand and to know this bit of legislation about these cities of refuge and how you care for, how you sort through issues of justice and to protect those who are innocent. But notice that the killer has to stay in a city, even if it's accidental. In other words, if someone here in Whitensville were to commit negligent homicide this week, and the nearest city of refuge is, let's say, Attleboro, you'd have to get out your way over to Attleboro, and you don't get to come back when you're cleared of first-degree murder. That person had to stay there until the death of the current high priest, Numbers 35 tells us. If you had a younger high priest, you could be there for a very long time. See, God takes life very seriously. Israel's rules set a value even on accidental death, but it also sets limits to the price of vengeance. You might be angry or suspicious about the circumstances of a family member's death, but God sets limits to keep his people from doing anything about it in anger. Even true murderers, we read in verse 11, could flee to these cities so that their cases could be properly judged. Here we see how God cares for both the victims of crime, but God also cares for the perpetrators of crime, something we don't always like to acknowledge, unless we're the perpetrator, of course. God cares for those who are sinned against, and God cares for the sinner. Elsewhere in the Old Testament, we see how God does this. You find instructions about caring for preventing negligent homicide through something like primitive building codes. That's in Deuteronomy 22, verse 8. Or instructions about the possession of a dangerous animal, Exodus 21, verse 29. Deuteronomy 22, verse 8. Exodus 21, verse 29. There's a lot of other things. Dan Voss is here this week, and he can tell you all about Israel's legal system later on if you want to catch him afterwards. He'd probably be happy to, actually. Knows a few things about that. But one of the things that we see in the Bible is that it's immensely practical when it comes to life issues. Maybe we wouldn't copy the things verbatim into today's building codes, for example, or today's rules, but we see that God cares about the practical ways in which we affirm the value of life. Over and over again, we hear the message that God is a God of life. As our contemporary testimony puts it, we don't harm, we don't abuse, we don't diminish the gift, we don't foolishly take risks, we don't harm ourselves, we care for the vulnerable. And we realize that tragic accidents do actually happen. George Truett was a longtime pastor of the First Baptist Church of Dallas, Texas. He served there for 40 years in the early 1900s. Under his leadership, the church grew to be the largest church in the world at that time. He served as president of the Southern Baptist Convention and the Baptist World Alliance, and one time he preached a sermon on the steps of the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., because there was no other venue in the city of Washington that was big enough for the crowds who wanted to hear him preach. But this great pastor also knew the horror of having a friend die at his hands. It was just 6 months into his ministry in Dallas. He went on a hunting trip with one of his best friends, and they came to a barbed wire fence, and so he had set his gun down on the ground in order to stretch apart the barbed wire and hold it so his friend could climb through. But as he put his gun down, it accidentally discharged, hit his friend, who died the next day. Truett blamed himself. He planned to just resign from ministry. Took a lot of convincing from his friends and church members that he should continue. But it was said that his preaching was forever changed by that accident because he spoke with a compassion and a heart for lost people, because he understood what it meant to be lost, what it meant to have things in his life that were out of control, that hurt, what it meant to be somebody who had harmed someone else even without intending to do so, and to know the need for grace and for mercy. To God, the giver of refuge. Now, we live today in what's been called a culture of death. Although when I look at the brutal wars of the Middle Ages or the torturous practices of ancient rulers, I'm not sure that we've really got a corner of culture of death today. But there's a lot of different examples given in our culture of what plays into this culture of death. Legalized abortion, for example. Now, of course, the legal landscape is different today even than it was a couple of months ago. But this is still a live issue in our country, and especially in our state. Massachusetts has one of the highest rates of approval rates of abortion of all the 50 states. There's 20,000 abortions a year that happen here. We're a state that currently invites other people to come to get abortions here when their own states have more restrictive laws. More than 60 million abortions have taken place in this country since 1973, the Roe versus Wade decision. It's a fifth of the population of the United States currently. Now, there are all sorts of justifications and explanations given for why abortion might be necessary. Sometimes these are even given in the church, but the basic fact remains that abortion ends the life of an unborn human being. It's not just a blob of tissue. It's not less than human because it's unborn. And yes, we have to have compassion about the reasons that a woman might choose abortion, or a man might push her into it. If you look at the statistics, it's quite likely that even in this room, that we're speaking to people here this morning who have been touched by this themselves, who have made this decision, who have somebody close to them who made that decision. We need to have compassion when we think about this. But even in our compassion, we affirm that life is a gift from God, and that abortion essentially pursues an innocent human life and takes it. And as followers of Jesus Christ, we protest, we said this morning, all that harms or diminishes this gift, especially in the vulnerability of a mother's womb. Now, of course, abortion is just one strand in an ethic of life. At the other end of the spectrum, we think about those who are vulnerable. And we think about the society increasingly pushing a right to die, to end one's own life with medical assistance. Physician-assisted suicide is now legal in 10 states. It's under discussion here in Massachusetts. As with so many life issues, it's framed in terms of compassion, right? We don't want people to suffer. They don't want to be a burden to others. But sometimes in the process of these discussions, we diminish the privilege of caring for others. Or we diminish the spiritual discipline of letting someone else care for us. It's a hard thing to have to be cared for, isn't it? Especially when we're such an independent nation and independent people. Releasing control over life and death reminds us that we live under the authority of God the Creator. And in the words of a Synod decision report that was made a couple of years ago, CRC Synod said this: the church community is a community that shares burdens and links hands with the suffering and the dying so that the burden of suffering is temporarily lifted in community. Now, of course, we could go on, right? I read recently that more than a third of murder cases do not result even in an arrest. That was crazy when I read that. The number only a few decades ago was 10%. And you look at these numbers and you say, well, why is this? Are murders that much harder to solve today? Or is there something else that's going on? Now, the issues are complex, but I imagine if someone killed somebody you loved, you would want resolution. And these issues, many of these issues, we see are more pronounced in communities where there's vulnerability, where there's poor, there's disabled. Communities of color, which are themselves, those issues themselves are a life kind of issue, affirming life, protecting life, especially the vulnerable. The contemporary testimony also mentions pollution, gluttony, addiction, or foolish risks as other ways that we cheapen life. To this, we could add society's casual attitude towards the challenges of those with disabilities, or our struggle to support those with mental illness. Again, an issue of growing importance in our world today. Now, each of these things could probably be its own sermon. I'm not going to try to preach 10 different sermons this morning on these things. You're probably very thankful for that. But the point of this list is to help us to see how many ways this plays out in the world. Our attitude about the world and our place in it goes back to our attitude about the significance of human life and the world in which we are to live. Are the poor, are the vulnerable, are the older folks in life, are the unborn worth our compassion and our protection? Life is a gift from God's hand, and so we receive it thankfully with reverence for God. And so one of the things that we're challenged to see and to do this morning is to ask, who is God and who am I in God's presence? And we say over and over again in our theological tradition, who am I? I am not my own. A crazy thing to say in today's world. I'm not my own. I live under the authority and I live under the protection and I live with the gift that comes from knowing a faithful Savior to whom I belong. And I want to look briefly at 3 principles about life that we can observe in the instruction about the cities of refuge. The first thing that I want us to see this morning is how present God is in these verses. God is present as the one who gives, who protects, the God who is holy. God gives life, doesn't he? He gives the land and everything in it. He protects his people. He sustains. And the whole culture of Israel, its justice system, and its way of taking life seriously has God in, I was going to say in the background, but it's really has God in the foreground. How many times doesn't this text say, it's the Lord who gave you the land, who gives you, calls you as his people? The ultimate motivation for everything that Israel does is that innocent blood may not be shed in your land, we read in verse 10. And here in this chapter, we have a call too to see how we live before the presence of a holy and a good and a loving and a giving God. And not only to just say that for ourselves, but then to ask ourselves, how do we say that to people around us? How do we say that to the culture around us? And sometimes this means that we have to protest and resist. We have to send letters, we have to speak out, saying that life matters, that God cares about it. That we don't want to be guilty of shedding innocent blood. We don't want the people around us, even perhaps without acknowledging it, without recognizing it, to be guilty of shedding innocent blood. We're called to be people who affirm life because life is a gift from God, and God should be on display in everything that we say and everything that we do. When we talk about protesting and marching, and of course we realize that it's not enough. In fact, protesting and marching should be only the smallest part of what we do. Secondly, what we need to do is provide places where life can flourish. And I think it's interesting that Israel was told not only to make sure that the cities of refuge were spread evenly throughout the land, but that they were accessible to the ones who was fleeing. Now, the newer translation, the NIV, says, figure out the distances. Some translations put it, build roads to them. I think it's arguable that figuring out the distances, building roads, this is all part of making sure that people can get to these cities. Making sure that people can get to these places where life is protected, where they can be safe. Could anything be more practical? Make sure that people can get to a place where the value of both justice and life is affirmed. And I think this is harder for us as churches and as individuals, isn't it? Because now we're talking about creating spaces. We're talking about building relationships. Not just writing letters, not just sending notes, not just hanging up cards or signing petitions. Sometimes it's easier to condemn somebody who's made a choice that we disagree with than to actually address the sense of hopelessness and fear that led to a decision. or to help that person find healing and forgiveness. Or we can look at those who struggle with disabilities or with mental illness, and we get intimidated. Because these are situations that go on for a long time, and there may not ever be a good solution to some of them. And because these are big problems, because these are problems that demand a lot from us, it's easier sometimes just to ignore them and hope they go away. But disease and struggle, and yes, the effects of sin, leave people feeling lonely and isolated. And what God does in contrast is to provide a city, a community where the hurt and the pain of accidental death can be dealt with, can be worked through, and it would serve as a place to buffer against the rage of a world that can only think of vengeance and personal convenience. And so we ask, what would it be for this to be a place where life can flourish, where each one of us looks forward to coming here on Sunday, because we know that here is a place where someone will see us for who we are in God's sight, with dignity, with honor. Not just as someone with a story that we don't really like, or someone who's done something that brings shame on us and on our family. Or not just someone who should be overlooked because of whatever it is that they were born into, but someone who matters to this community because they matter to the living God. The third thing we see here is that God seeks to continually expand the realm where the culture of life is affirmed. So it's a really interesting thing in verses 8 and 9. Moses says, if the Lord your God enlarges your territory, then you're to set aside 3 more cities. Now, as far as we know, this was never done. There were 3 cities on the eastern side of the Jordan. That's in Deuteronomy 4. There's 3 cities talked about here, and Joshua 20 will name what those cities are. But the principle is there. If God makes your territory bigger, then expand this principle elsewhere. Then make more cities where more people can come and be protected and find refuge and find shelter and find community and find protection in the name of the living God. See, the church is not simply to be a holy community in which we all think and do the right things, and because we want to think and do the right things, we keep to ourselves. It's to be a community that continually seeks to expand the places where the knowledge of God is known as creator and author of life. And sometimes this means we have to go into tough places where our message isn't immediately accepted. To build community with people perhaps who think very differently than we do, who don't understand why the ways that we affirm life in the church would be important in a world that belongs to God. Because maybe they don't even see the world as belonging to God in the first place. To go into tough places with people maybe who feel vulnerable and overlooked, and who don't know that they matter, and to extend to them the support and the fellowship of the living God. See, the world will constantly say, well, it's mine, it's my body, it's my choice, I can do with it whatever I want, as long as no one is loud or not powerful enough to oppose me. What I'm going to do doesn't hurt anyone, does it? The Christian faith, by contrast, says that the greatest comfort is that we are not our own, but we belong to each other. And because we belong to each other, as we read in the Catechism this morning, we want to step in to protect and preserve, and not simply be bystanders when others are diminished and put down. Because we're not our own, we can't simply make decisions in light of what we want, but we respond to another. We respond to God, the giver of life. You know, if we read of the cities of refuge, we remember that God has given each of us a place to run, where we can be safe from the effects of sins, the wrongs that we do, the wrongs that are done to us, simply because we live in a world that's not the way it's supposed to be. We all, in some way or other, are caught up in this culture of death. You know, we talk about some of these big cultural issues, and some of us maybe say, well, you know, that I'm trying to be on the right side of that issue, or I'm trying to make sure that I speak out on that issue. But we read the list from the Catechism this morning, I think we see that there are all ways that we're caught up in these cycles, putting others down, diminishing, speaking evil of them. We all need a refuge from the world. We all need a refuge for ourselves, from ourselves. We all need to flee to Jesus for forgiveness and protection from the one who seeks our life, from the effects of sin in this world, and from the devil and all his forces. We need to flee to him so that our lives, in the words of Colossians 3, our lives may be hidden with Christ in God. There's only one. Only Christ, who ultimately gives refuge and forgiveness. And as we stay in that place of refuge, we testify to the goodness of God, who protects our soul from harm and who has paid the price of our guilt on the cross. My dream, my prayer for the church, for this church, is that we would increasingly become a community that builds a culture of life. And by that I mean a community that shares a commitment to the Lord of life, that recognizes and protests and resists all that harms, abuses, and diminishes the gift of life. I hope that we take seriously our role in the public dialogue to witness to the presence of God when it comes to discussions about abortion or euthanasia or other life issues. But more than that, I pray that we increasingly become a community where wounded and frightened people can flee. A place that gives the gift of life in Jesus' name. And I get excited when I hear stories about people who speak to somebody that they met on the job site. Somebody who's reeling from the effects of, maybe it was a divorce, or maybe it was something that was done to them. And they may not be able to fix that big situation, but they can provide a place to process, a place to find rest and refuge. I get excited when I hear stories about those who sit with a frail older person or perhaps a young person with limited abilities for the afternoon so that a weary spouse or a parent can get a break. I get excited when I hear stories about people who go and sit with those who are sick or weak or dying so that they know they're not alone. Who to say to frightened unwed mothers, I'm here with you so that you can get through this. Because Jesus himself has done those things for us. For when we all embrace the lives around us, especially the most vulnerable, we treat life with awe and respect, with reverence for God, our Creator, with God who is our refuge for life in a world of death. Let's pray.